the trials are kind of beyond the point of it. One way to think about this is that if you're a victim of a terrible atrocity, you know you can't get justice. You can't bring back the dead. It probably helps a bit to see the people responsible suffer, but what drives you really, really crazy is the feeling that other people are not seeing or acknowledging or validating your pain and what you've experienced, and especially the truth of what you experienced.
Tell me what's a life? I've been feeling starstruck, seeing human love thrive in this really long dusk. Guess it's really all love, 7 billion of us, and I read the headlines. Tell me what's a life? It's potlucks of violence, corn shucked to conscience, hot sauce, blood diamonds. Everybody pitching in force red with silence. We already ate up that cold bread.
Hi, I'm Michael.
And I'm Obasi. So, my friend Michael and I have come into adulthood watching our world become more and more polarized. From political polarization to income inequality to how we even define what is real. It feels like schism and conflict are everywhere. Like everything is coming apart. It feels like we need some type of meta solution, regardless of the issue. Like, how do we come back together? What does it look like to make peace?
And at the same time, the world hasn't literally fallen apart yet. So people must be making peace on some level. So that's where we want to start. We want to learn who's making peace and how we can apply that to the rest of our world.
So join us as we try to find everyday peacemakers and learn what peacemaking means to them.
Each episode, we'll learn one principle of peacemaking from our guest. These are featured as a growing tribute to our guests and their wisdom at principlesofpeacemaking.org.
Today we hear from Gabe, a law professional who tells us about his work seeking truth and reconciliation in the Solomon Islands. Gabe describes the stories he heard on his journey and teaches us the value of witnessing others' suffering, defining a collective truth, and being honest with ourselves, even when it hurts. Today's principle of peacemaking: truth heals.
I'll start by telling it from my perspective, and if it gets too narcissistic, then you can edit that out more. But basically, I've always been interested in human rights issues and transitional justice issues. And when I went to law school in the early 2000s, human rights there was a lot of excitement about using the courts for human rights, using international law and international justice. You had the International Criminal Tribunal. It was about to be set up, and you had some other tribunals happening, and there was really a sense that you could get like a lot done. So I graduated and I worked as a lawyer for a bit, and then I went to Cambodia. I'd gone in law school, and then I came back, and I worked with the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and I got pretty jaded about it. I found that it wasn't really serving victims well, although they kind of tried to a bit, but it was a little tough because it's worth talking about kind of international human rights, kind of law, or kind of international criminal law, let's call it. After World War II, you have the Nuremberg trials for the Nazis, right? And the thing is, the Germans kept very good records, and they were super clear about what they were doing. So it was a very satisfying trial in a lot of ways, because it was like Germans on trial. They were like, yes, here's the evidence. This is where I said I was going to kill all the Jews. Yes. And it was very clear cut who was in charge. And so you're able to kind of hold people responsible. But then when it comes to like Cambodia in the 70s under the Khmer Rouge, it's a little tricky because hundreds of thousands of people, possibly over 1 million people, possibly a quarter of the country were killed. But they were not exactly killed in a top-down way, and they were not targeted for their ethnicity. They were really targeted more based on class and being urban people, what they called new people. You'd have a lot of cases where the people in charge were kind of not were running things very well, and they would kind of say, your district has to produce this much rice, without kind of specifying how or what consequences. And then people started killing people so that they could take their rice rations and send them in or whatever. Now, whose fault is that? Is that genocide? It gets really messy. And I got very involved with the defense side of the tribunal, which wasn't necessarily arguing that the people being put on trial were good, but it was kind of that this is a lot more actors at fault here, including maybe the United States in a lot of ways, and certainly China and some other foreign actors. And I started to really understand that in some ways the trials are kind of beyond the point a bit. One way to think about this is that if you're a victim of a terrible atrocity, you know you can't get justice. You can't bring back the dead. It probably helps a bit to see the people responsible suffer. But what drives you really, really crazy is the feeling that other people are not seeing or acknowledging or validating your pain and what you've experienced, and especially the truth of what you experienced. And that's why, so truth commissions kind of start in Latin America in the 80s and then very famously used in South Africa. And really the point was that you kind of needed truth and reconciliation. So the idea was, first of all, to actually get the truth out. So you give amnesty to people if they will kind of tell the truth and acknowledge what happened. But then you also need the reconciliation with both the perpetrators or the people involved. First of all, agreeing and acknowledging that this happened, that they're not going to deny that they did this. They killed people, they hurt people, people suffered because of them, and reconciling. And people think of reconciliation to mean kind of like this kind of namby-pamby, like let's shake hands things. But it should be something very culturally meaningful that really is about kind of coming to terms with one another, really kind of recognizing each other, like eye to eye, face to face. If you go back to the Holocaust example, when I think about after the Holocaust, as a Jewish American, what's meaningful to me is that Germans I meet go through a lot of Holocaust education and really have to come to terms with their past and with what happened in their country. That is much more important to me than the fact that decades ago, a few dozen people were put on trial and convicted. But maybe I'd feel differently if I was a victim. But I saw on Wikipedia that there is a truth commission in the Solomon Islands, which I did not know much about the Solomon Islands. But the more I looked into it, it seemed very interesting, and I couldn't find anything more about it. There was no website. There was like maybe some brief articles in the news. So I ended up just booking a flight and flying over there for a couple months to go to the Solomon Islands and get involved and kind of see what happened. So I get there, I end up kind of volunteering with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I wrote a big piece of their final report. And I did a lot of interviews, both for the Truth Commission and then also my own kind of reports to my own interviews to kind of write about this. And that's the story I have to tell you. It's about what I kind of found out about this situation.
First of all, so real. And like, certainly with trauma survivors, what we do all the time is like, they will very, very often have revenge fantasies. And part of healing is recognizing that actually this person's suffering isn't going to make your suffering not have happened. And kind of grieving the fact, like, you suffered and literally nothing is going to make that not true. And there are things you can do to pass it on for future people who will suffer, but that's about as close as we can get.
Yeah. Like just thinking about like peacemaking generally, like that as kind of like, a potential principle of peacemaking, like that you need to just acknowledge truth. Like you have to share the same understanding of truth. It just seems really hard. Like you were saying, things are just really complicated usually. And like everybody has their own vantage point on a situation. So like, who is really like the perpetrator of the genocide here? Like how many people are implicated in this? And even the victims, like understanding may need to shift in some way in order to like come to like a shared understanding of truth. But of course, it needs to shift in a way that's like healing, not in a way that like leaves the like truth of their kind of experience out. So I just find that all like really interesting. And I don't know how to make that play out well. Which makes me really interested to hear, like, the story in the Solomon Islands and, like, how they managed to, reckon with those kind of, like, really difficult problems with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so...
So the Solomon Islands, for listeners who might not know, are a atoll, like a chain of islands, volcanic islands mostly, northeast of Australia, so kind of off the coast of Australia, populated by Melanesian peoples. And I do want to zoom back and tell you this kind of story of what kind of happened in the Solomon Islands because it's not very well known, at least in our country. So basically, the Solomon Islands were colonized by England, by the British Empire in like the late 1800s, but pretty much left alone as a protectorate. They didn't really have that much of interest. Certainly they suffered a bit. So the two main islands are Guadalcanal, which is populated by Guale people, and Malaita, which is populated by Malaitans. And especially the Malaitans were often what they called blackbirded, which meant kind of recruited to Australia to work in sugarcane fields as kind of indentured servants. But in general, the Solomon Islands was mostly kind of left alone. And it was like pretty peaceful. I mean, I don't want to like romanticize it, but it wasn't as oppressed as a lot of other colonized places. Then this kind of idyll comes to an end in the 30s when the Solomon Islands finds itself one of the biggest turning points of World War II. So basically, the Japanese are advancing towards Australia. They take over the Solomon Islands. They oppress the people quite a lot. And they decided to build an airfield in Guadalcanal that they're going to use to invade Australia. Then the U.S. comes over to try to stop them before they can build this airfield, and there ends up being this huge war. Hundreds of thousands of troops involved, tens of thousands die. The Japanese lose 2 battleships. The Americans lose 2 aircraft carriers. There's so much loss there that they still call the waters off of Honiara, which is the capital now, Iron Bottom Sound. And basically the Solomon Islanders, there's so much cargo left over from this war, like literally just like buildings and chunks of metal left over, that they moved their capital to Honiara, where the airfield was. And that's still the airfield that I flew into to get to the Solomon Islands. And they built this capital in Guadalcanal, which is kind of a problem because the people who mostly move into this capital city are Malaitans from that other big island, because they're a bit more, let's say, aggressive, sophisticated in culture. They had a little more Western interaction. There's a bunch of reasons, but they basically kind of come in to populate the city and serve as kind of like the police and government, while the Guale people from Guadalcanal are a little bit more rural and introverted culturally and just kind of shy away. Also, there's a bit of a problem because the Malaitan people pass on their property through the father, and the Guale people do it through the mother. And so after a couple of generations, you've got a lot of controversy about who owns what and what's going on. And this all comes to a head in the late 90s when the Malaitan people, the Guale people rise up against the Malaitans. And here's where it gets crazy. There's no army here, and there's not really much like many like arms. So the Guale people dig up the old guns from the Battle of Guadalcanal, and they kind of refurbish them a bit, these old World War II guns, and they invade the capital city with their like reconstructed old kind of post-apocalyptic guns. And then the Malaitan people basically kind of defend themselves with like mostly with kind of police weapons. But so it becomes pretty quickly a standoff between the city of Honiara and the rest of Guadalcanal. The government basically kind of collapses, and for a few years you have what they call the tensions. And during the tensions, there's this kind of standoff. There's not really I think over 100 people died. Thousands of people were displaced, but not obviously a lot of suffering and some other issues. But not again, it's nothing like Cambodia. Like not not widespread atrocity. But certainly there was an absence of peace, and and it was terrible for a lot of people. This all ends in 2003 when Australia kind of quietly invades. At the same time as the US is invading Iraq very loudly, Australia kind of quietly does what they call the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands, RAMSI. RAMSI is also another coalition of the willing between Australia, New Zealand, and a bunch of Pacific Islands. And they basically kind of send this assistance mission, the peacekeeping mission, to kind of hold peace. And when I went to the Solomon Islands in 2011, it was still basically kind of run by RAMSI. There was a provisional government, but RAMSI was kind of still running the place. And the Australians were trying really hard to do nation building and justice differently than the Americans are doing in Iraq. They were trying really hard to be kind of humble about it and to defer to like local people about things. Even still, the Solomon Islanders mostly hated their guts and just wanted them gone. And so I could come in and people would first perceive me as an Australian and just like scowl. And then when they heard I was American, they'd be like, "Oh, Americans! Oh my God!" They would just get so excited. So, and this was very interesting. And I got to talk to a lot of New Zealanders and Australians and all kinds of people. So I talked to a lot of folks about kind of reconstructing the justice sector there, right? And they're trying to reconstruct the justice sector on, British Australian kind of lines. And some lines used to be British. And I talked to some of the folks who were kind of running the prison, and they said that at first they came in and they treated these prisoners, some of whom were prisoners from this war, or people who were kind of captured in the war, or whatever. They started treating them like the way that we would treat prisoners. So they were kind of like, yeah, they weren't abusing them, right? But they were really exerting their authority and were telling them where to go and what to do, and treating them very, very kind of harshly. That they to make sure there's this order, that nothing gets out of line. And they got a lot of resistance that people really did not appreciate it. And what they came to understand was that in the Solomon Islands, the view was that if you're a prisoner, then that's your role in society, that's your fate, that's what happened. But you're still equal, and you still have to be acknowledged as a person. And so if you're a prisoner, the prisoners will actually just do what they're supposed to do, and they won't like push the boundaries, they won't push the lines unless they feel like they're kind of disrespected or treated less than. And a lot of things were kind of like that. That it just kind of, you started realizing that this kind of Western system was imposing strict rules and unnecessary complexity on that maybe is more useful if you've got a society of millions of people coming from different places. But in the Solomon Islands, a lot of things could be just done through kind of custom. And that I don't want to romanticize that. Again, I talked to someone trying to start a local person trying to start a clean energy project who found it super impossible to get anything done. Or definitely a lot of women suffered a lot of sexual violence, and that was another thing I want to mention here is that working on the Truth Commission, you might ask, like, what's the point of this Truth Commission? Gathering all this testimony. And one of the things one of the great examples I did learn, right, was that if you have trials, a lot of folks in the Solomon Islands were not going to talk about sexual violence. It just wasn't something they would talk about in public on a witness stand and with their name attached. But if you had I trained a lot of testimony takers who kind of go, on foot and go knock on the door and talk to someone and take an anonymous statement. And suddenly hundreds of anonymous statements are coming in about all kinds of sexual violence suffered, right?
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like, just again on that like truth theme, it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, which is from Nietzsche, and he's talking about how like he's just like ragging on Kant, like as he does, because that's his like favorite thing to do. But he's like, Kant is always like looking for pure reason, or like pure like knowledge, objective truth. But like the problem is that nobody can have objective truth because there is no seeing without an eye. Like if you see, you're seeing from a perspective. And so the only way that we can even approximate objectivity is to get as many eyes as possible, like get voices from as many different like angles as possible. So I really like that, like as an answer to that question of like how do we come to truth? I think it's like you have to be open to hearing other people express their version of the story. And then as many of those, when you collect a lot of those, you get a better answer. The other thing I was thinking about as you were just talking is just this kind of Western perspective that we come in with. And it's like, it's not wrong. Like you're saying, like there's, we don't want to romanticize like the Solomon Islands. It's not that like we have everything wrong and they have everything right, but it's that we have a particular perspective and we come in and like we treat prisoners how we think prisoners are just supposed to be treated because we think, well, that's just who prisoners are. But then we just forget that like our perspective is always limited and that somebody else's perspective can always inform it, which I think is really interesting.
So I get there, I land. I end up staying in this little rest house that was run by this monastic order, and it was a little odd. There were people walking around kind of barefoot who were just kind of smiling and very excited about Christianity, but they're all super nice to me, and then I kind of go about kind of meeting people and making connections and find myself really doing a lot of great interviews. And then I was very surprised to find out eventually that the most impressive peacemakers were actually the people who ran my guest house, who were called the Melanesian Brotherhood, the folks who were walking around barefoot. They were the real peacemakers and the heroes of my story. They're an Anglican order that's based in the Solomon Islands. Most of the brothers are Melanesian, although not all. Some come from elsewhere. And they really I'm certainly not totally up on my theology, but they really try to certainly live up to a certain vision of Jesus's legacy and to what God expects of them. And they were very respected on the islands. And when this war started, Brother Harry Garreau, who was the kind of head brother, reached out to the Anglican Church and said, "Oh, there's a war here. Like, what do we do? I got all these brothers. What is our role as Christians in this conflict?" And the hierarchy told them to retreat to Balia, which is basically this retreat that they had kind of up in the hills. And that was kind of their own like, sanctuary, kind of headquarters. And they did this at first, but a lot of the brothers felt very torn about this because they felt like they had a role as peacemakers. And they felt like if Jesus were here in this conflict, then Jesus would not be retreating to Tabalia. He would be on the front lines, getting his feet dirty at personal risk, and he wouldn't really care about safety because it's just your mortal life on Earth or whatever. And so a lot of the brothers really felt like they should actually get involved. And Brother Harry, the leader, was supportive of this. He definitely felt so. He kind of disobeyed the hierarchy, and the Melanesian Brotherhood inserted themselves into this conflict at great personal risk. And one of the main ways they did this was that the brothers would literally walk around barefoot, and they would go to like the front lines of these standoffs, and they would just walk barefoot towards the combatants and ask them to kneel and to pray with them, and then to give up their guns. And this worked quite well. And actually, a lot of folks were very moved and gave up their guns and stopped fighting. Because ultimately, this all was kind of this tempest in a teapot. I mean, what were people really fighting over? Was this really the best way? And it was tied together with cultural ideas about conflict and about how to resolve. There were ways, organic ways in the culture of dealing with these conflicts that had kind of spun a bit out of control. So there were certain ways in which everyone kind of could just step back and say, wait a minute, we don't need to shoot each other. We don't actually need these guns. And there was also real beliefs about the power of the brotherhood. People really believed that the brothers were bulletproof, that God was protecting them, and that if God's messenger here on earth is telling you to lay down your arms and pray, then it's not a time to start arguing or fighting or whatever. And this worked really well, and I really think that they were a tremendous force for peace. But there is another part of this story, which is that early on in the conflict, there was a guy named Harold Keke, who was one of the warlords, a Gwale, so like on the Guadalcanal, a Gwale warlord, who was fighting. He actually got a kind of shot in the head, and he survived, and he went a little crazy, or maybe he was always crazy. This always gets kind of complicated. But it became a bit of a Heart of Darkness scenario where he moved to the other side of Guadalcanal. So Guadalcanal is this big island, and there's really only a road on one side, and the other side is roadless. And it would take a 4-day trek through the jungle to get to the other side of the island. And the other side is called the Weather Coast, because it's actually really hard to even land a ship there. So he moved to the Weather Coast, and he kind of created his own little fiefdom that was out of control. And literally, the government forces kept trying to, or even Ramsey kept trying to go over there to dislodge him. But no one could do it because it was kind of hard to land folks there. It was really dangerous. So he was kind of running his own operation out there. And a bunch of the Melanesian brothers felt like they could do something about this. And Brother Harry, the head brother, was really torn over what to do about this because this seemed very dangerous and a situation more out of control. But ultimately, he kind of gave his blessing to this. And one of the brothers went over to the Weather Coast to try to talk some sense to Harold Keke. And Keke immediately kind of accused him of being a spy and tortured him to death. And this brother was not heard from. So then 6 other brothers went there, and they were all killed as well. So first of all, this shatters the myth of the bulletproof brothers. So irreparable harm to the brotherhood. Then they're a tight-knit group. A lot of kind of questions about whether why was this a good idea or not. Eventually Harold Keke is captured, put on trial, put in jail. To me, Brother Harry, who I talked to, is a super humble man, one of the most impressive people I've ever met, one of the most thoughtful and humble and caring people, empathic people I ever talked to. And yet he was very racked with guilt about this whole experience. To me, he was a hero of this whole conflict. His actions to me saved many, many lives and relieved much suffering. But of course, he's preoccupied by the fact that he contributed to the death of 7 of his good friends and brothers who were relying on him for guidance. And as a religious person, he had a lot of conflict about this, a lot of internal conflict about whether was he truly listening to God, was he doing what the godly thing to do was, or was he letting his kind of ego get in the way, or were they really acting smartly or not? Like, what could he have done about this? And so, yeah, I mean, he could talk about it. He's obviously still in the order. I think he still has a lot of pride in what he did. But it's really interesting to note that, I talked to a lot of folks with really big egos, a lot of these warlords who talk on and on about how what they did was standing up for their people, and they're not ashamed of what happened, or they'll justify a lot of self-justification from the warlords, from the Australians, from the UN folks, from every party involved. Is very self-justifying. And yet I will note that Brother Harry was more kind of racked by guilt. And I think he actually feels like he kind of suffers a lot from what happened. And that, to me, that was kind of an interesting lesson about peacemaking and about the toll of peacemaking and the experience of being a peacemaker.
The main thing that comes to my head is just this idea at the end of justification versus kind of a personal truth, or maybe a religious truth, of like staying true to that. I don't know if you've ever encountered the Arbinger Institute. I had never, and then I read a book by them. And they talk about this idea of, it's kind of like supposed to be a psychology of peacemaking, and they talk about this idea of self-betrayal, which is this kind of when you feel you should have done something for someone and you don't, you betray yourself because you're not acting in accordance with your own values. And most people respond to that by justifying it. And usually they justify it by kind of dehumanizing the person they didn't help. And so I'm just having this reaction of I do have a lot of respect for this brother. So many psychologists or like people that I know would be like, well, don't feel bad. Like, you did so much good. Like, I don't know that feeling bad is necessarily not a feeling of being at peace also in some ways. Feeling that guilt could be a way of feeling love and kind of not betraying himself to say like, let me justify this in the scheme of the greater war and something. And so I just have a lot of respect for that.
Yeah, I will note that I can send you pictures of the graves of the 7 brothers who died are given kind of prominent placement in this retreat in Tabalia, and they're very, very honored, right, and respected. And so they really are kind of part of the brotherhood in a way. So I think you're right that his guilt was motivated by love and by staying. It's a way to kind of in some ways stay in touch with his lost brothers.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting because you want to say, or like, I guess I am, kind of tempted to say, well, maybe he should be more like the warlords who just like, have decided that they're going to positively integrate this into their like self-image and say, I'm a great guy who did great things and the world around me like didn't respond in the ways that it should have or whatever. But I guess I think people are more complicated than that maybe, and that like maybe that process itself is hard on people. Like I think, like going back to the truth thing, it's clear that like Brother Harry is trying to tell himself the truth, whereas these other people are maybe trying to tell themselves lies in order to like make everything work for them. And I wonder if that works out better for him. But I'm also like, I don't know that peacemaking doesn't sometimes end in just like suffering. There was harm that was done, and you can't erase the suffering, or you can't like, do peacemaking so well that like now there is no more pain involved. In order to bring so much like good and peace to the world, he did have to like go through things that are maybe going to like weigh on him permanently.
Yeah, I agree. And if we are more truthful, then at least future generations can kind of learn from the lessons and can grow up in a world that makes more sense to them. Again, when I compare that to like Cambodia, where I just met all these young people, people younger than me, who just growing up in this traumatized world and did not understand why their country was so different, why their upbringing was so different than their neighbors in Thailand or Vietnam, or Vietnam had a war too. Like why is there so much suffering and just weird tension and darkness in Cambodia? But then so I mean, it's true. Like maybe if we're more like Brother Harry, and even if we have to shoulder some more of that burden, it helps that those we talk to and those we pass our lessons on to don't have to deal with our kind of self-lying or whatever.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that it's true also that like Brother Harry is probably dealing with less pain and suffering now than he would have been dealing with if he had not, participated in this peacemaking activity. That like if the standoff was still going on, so there is some sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice that like produces so much good that like yes, that like the future generations get to live in it. And I think also hopefully you get to live in it too, even if there are scars from the harm that you had to resolve.
Tell me what's a life? I've been feeling starstruck, seeing human love thrive in this really long dusk. Guess it's really all love, 7 billion of us. Then I read the headlines. Tell me what's a life? It's potlucks of violence, corn shucked the conscience, hot sauce, blood diamonds. Everybody pitching in forks red with silence. We already ate up that cornbread of kindness. Or it's something in between. We got stories in our stories, knowing stories what it seems. As we stumble, as we fall, we watch each other and we scream. If our weakness is our glory, it's more glory to be seen.
This has been the Peacemakers podcast, produced and hosted by me, Obasi Shah, and my co-host, Michael O'Brien. The intro and outro song, What's a Life, is by me and produced by Eerie Skies. The interludes are produced by Gabe Gladstein of the pop duo Running On Everything. If you liked this episode and want to reflect more, come visit our website at principlesofpeacemaking.org, where you can find more of our content and information on how to support us. Our guest today was Gabe Kiris. Thanks, Gabe. And thank you for listening. Now go and make peace.